r/AskReddit. What was the biggest misconception that you had as a child? I thought having a job was just you picking a company you like, waltz in, find an empty spot, and start doing something. I had no concept of interviews, tests, and all the paperwork involved. To be fair, some of the older generation act like that's the way it is when giving advice. My grandfather told us stories that it used to be like that. There was a severe labor shortage, so you'd walk into a factory in the morning and get hired on the spot. If you didn't like the work, you'd quit after a short period and just go to the factory next door. Repeat. He said he had about 16 jobs in 1 week at one time. My mum always told me that if I got lost or separated from her while out in public and couldn't find a police officer, I should seek out the nearest woman with children. Her reasoning was obviously that another mother would be a good kind of stranger to talk to, much more likely to help, and less likely to harm a lost child. My reasoning, however, was that if I somehow never found my own mum again, I could and would just go home with a woman and have new siblings to play with, so I wouldn't get lonely. My mom always said the same thing. It actually worked. I was a teenager flying home alone on what was only my second time on a plane. Departure flight was my first. The plane was having malfunctions and needed to make an emergency landing in another city. The next flight home wasn't until 2 p.m. the next day. I was just a kid and had to figure out how to get a hotel room and a cab there and get back on a new flight the next day. This was before cell phones and laptops were mainstream. So I found a mom with kids. She made sure I got dinner, gave me a quarter for a payphone call home, squished me into a cab with her family, checked me into the hotel, got me back to the airport the next day, and sat with me on the flight home. I stayed in touch with her for a while. I still think about her kindness every now and then with gratitude, 20 years later. I thought being fired from work meant that the fired person gets killed. Every time my mom would tell me and my sisters not to bother her or she could get fired from work, she partially worked from home, I assumed that her boss would come into her office and literally shoot her. I was so terrified that my mom would get in any trouble at work. Oh my god, I thought a really similar thing. Whenever people would explain people getting fired to me, when I was really young they'd say, some person got fired and lost their job, which made me think, well, I guess that means getting fired and losing your job are two different things. And so that meant I had to come up with an explanation for what being fired is, so I thought, well, it must mean you get burnt, right? I'm sorry James, due to budget restrictions we need to cut back on staff. Pulls out flamethrower. That there was absolutely no way I'd ever get to be as old as the adults in my life. For some reason it seemed more likely to me that I could become a dog than that I could age into even a 15-year-old. In the 70s, I was 8 years old. I remember asking my mom if I would live to see the year 2000. She said I would, though I didn't believe her. To a child, 25 years is a long time. Now 25 years seems like a blink of an eye. Even one day feels long, because it's a relatively big portion of your life up to that point, and it's filled with so many new things being thrust at you constantly. As an adult, now, I have to actively seek new knowledge and hobbies, but even so, the vast majority of my day is exactly like the previous 365 of them, and will be very similar to the next 365. My parents weren't raised in the US, but they tried to make sure my siblings and I got the whole American experience, so they tried introducing us to Christmas and even sent us to Christian summer camps. For some reason, this caused a sort of confusion in my mind, and I thought Santa was God, and I was never corrected, because my parents didn't understand Christianity or Christmas. Ho. 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 My daughter declared Santa was her god, and used to pray to him all year round. Makes sense, you're never given presents addressed from God. That my dad just always knew the way. On vacation, in unfamiliar cities, everywhere. I learned about maps and reading road signs later. I'm still amazed that people manage to drive somewhere new without GPS. I remember the first time I encountered a GPS in a friend's car and I nearly cried. She said, "I just enter the starting address and the destination address, and it will tell us how to get there." I thought, that's nonsense. There's no way that's going to happen. If you missed an exit on the highway, you would basically end up in a different state. Judging by the way people cut across 4 lanes of traffic, rather than spend a few extra minutes turning around at the next exit, I feel like there are some adults that still think this is true. I've done that. When I first moved to Memphis, I missed the exit to my house and ended up in Arkansas. To be fair, I can see Arkansas from my house. All that you needed to do to get pregnant was get married. I thought you had to be married and sleep in the same bed. Then if you both wanted a kid, then pregnancy would randomly happen at a later time, unless you were infertile. Then pregnancy just couldn't happen. I thought one boob was milk and the other was water. It made sense, because we needed to drink water to live right. My sister convinced me that butt cheeks held RP. That led me to believe that people with big bottoms held it in, and, yeah. For whatever reason, I always thought limes were just unripe lemons. When I was in my early 20s, I went to buy a lemon tree and was so confused to see that had lime and lemon trees. I feel like an idiot every time I think of it. Funny story. I had a lemon tree once that started producing limes. I didn't think much of it. I'd give the limes away to friends and juice them and cooking myself. Eventually I found out the lemon tree had a disease and they were lemons that would never ripen. Underneath the floor of a building was just an endless void. I thought people who replaced floors were incredibly brave, so I always told my parents I wanted to replace floors. This is adorable. For a year or so I wanted to be a tax collector. I saw one in a Pink Panther cartoon and thought they were just people who knocked on your door and kept all the money you paid them. I thought a potluck was where everyone brought food to a party and put it all in one giant pot. Then you would scoop out a plateful, and whatever you got was your luck. That actually sounds fun. And disgusting. I mean, with a little bit of planning you can make a nice stew that way. It would be pretty bad if everyone else brought stew stuff and Karen decided to bring jello and then insist on also putting it in the stew. I would bury coins in my backyard so I could dig them up next year and be rich because, you know, buried treasure. I thought you could actually grow a rainbow if you planted Skittles because I saw it in commercial. I would water the little area where I planted it every day for like a month before my parents finally told me the truth. That everyone I ever heard about was from my country. Eminem? French. The Pope? French. The Rolling Stones? French, of course. Elizabeth II? Congrats, you're now the Queen of France. Down syndrome was when you were really sad. I thought you could say something like, "Looks like you got a case of Down syndrome," to your crying friend. That would make for a funny sitcom episode. Kid walks up to his dad and goes, "What's Down syndrome?" The dad, not wanting to take the time to explain properly, goes, "It's when you're feeling really down." The kid goes to school the next day and sees someone crying in the corner and goes up to them and says, "Looks like you've got a bad case of Down syndrome," making the kid cry even harder. That trees made wind. Trees would move, and their movement makes the wind. I honestly love that I used to believe this. It's so innocent. Also, that if you saw the clouds move, it was actually the world spinning. As in the clouds would stay still, and world was turning. I also thought trees made wind. And I was always very confused when strong winds would break off branches. I mean, why would the tree make so much wind it broke itself? People actually died in movies. This must have been quite horrifying as a kid. I thought that kung fu was a sort of duel of life and death. You challenge someone, and you fight until one of you is dead. The other person doesn't have any injuries or anything. He magically recovers all HP, and is ready for another fight. I thought a male could only give to kids as they have 2 testicles, and that in the process of impregnating a woman, the testicles would explode. Bust a nut has a whole new meaning. Chicago was in China. What? Well, I'm an Australian, and I remember thinking that Chicago was in China when I was 6. I thought adults couldn't run because I've never saw my parents running. Not really can't run, just really don't want to. Those concrete walls on highways mean we are getting close to your destination. My parents said, "See those walls? It means we are getting close." Because there were some near where we lived, and a misconception was born. That not everyone has a sister. I was certain that everyone had a sister like me, and when I went to a friend's house to sleep over I was dumbfounded that his sister wasn't there. His parents ended up showing me a picture of some random kid and told me that was my friend's sister just to shut me up. That's a great way to end it. Not trying to convince the kid, but just showing some random girl. I thought drinking and driving meant having any beverage in a vehicle, had no clue about alcohol. In kindergarten I reported my mom for drinking and driving in the middle of a school assembly, and they called her in for a meeting. Everyone thought it was hilarious, but no one corrected me or taught me what it really meant, and I think it was like 6th or 7th grade before it all clicked.